We have been listening to President Trump take some questions while meeting with Lebanon's president. The president gave an update on the war with Iran, saying their leaders, quote unquote, desperately want to meet. And the U.S. is not interested until Iran wants to meet in a meaningful way, he said. He also said Iran hasn't seen anything yet in terms of military response. President Trump also saying he can't think about the midterm elections when deciding how to proceed with Iran. On the peace talks between Lebanon and Israel, the president said he's going to be looking at the possibility of putting pressure on Israel to withdraw its troops from Lebanon. I want to bring in NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba to talk more about what we just heard in the Oval. Monica, a lot of things were talked about there. I do want to talk about President Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, and why he's there and what likely he is to speak about with the president after this press call. But I want to talk first about Iran, because the president said that the Iranian government is desperate to meet with the United States, but the U.S. doesn't want to because it's not in a meaningful way. What do we know about this quote unquote desperation to meet? Because what we have been seeing is this back and forth of military responses, and Iran not looking like they're in a position to negotiate or wanting to be in a position to negotiate right now.
Yeah, and Yasmin, let me tell you, that exact phrase that Iran wants to, quote, desperately meet, according to the president, is one we have heard dozens and dozens of times throughout the course of this conflict. And sometimes it seems like perhaps that is the case, and we have seen some in-person negotiations stem from them. And other times it seems to be something that the president refers to or uses as a potential pressure tactic that doesn't necessarily mean that anything is going to happen imminently from a diplomatic standpoint, even though we do know from the White House that those talks do continue behind the scenes. There does seem to be that track that is still being pursued. We know that mediators, according to some reporting, have been talked about potential next steps diplomatically, but the White House does not seem very interested in that path right now, with a U.S. official telling me that essentially the president's mindset right now is to continue exacting some kind of response to Iran for the deaths of multiple service members in recent days, and, quote, they will continue to pay the price for their actions for those strikes that they have continued to take on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. And so right now it does seem that the president is continuing to imply that there could be some negotiated solution, but really nothing has changed fundamentally that would suggest that we're going to see anything shift here. And those tensions, interestingly, Yasmin, related to, of course, who the president has in the Oval Office there with President Aoun, because some of the negotiations that have taken place do concern Lebanon. And even though much of the memorandum of understanding does not apply right now in terms of some of those critical points between Iran and the U.S., one of the really important aspects is this negotiated withdrawal of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon that did just begin, that is sort of in a pilot phase that they're testing to see if more can continue. And we know that that is certainly what the Lebanese president and top officials are pressing the president and the White House on. They want to see the White House's assistance and backing of that in conjunction with, of course, the conversations the White House and the administration are continuing to have with the Israeli side of things.
I do want to get to this pilot zone agreement because it's an important one, and we do know the Lebanese president is likely going to be talking to the president of the United States about getting more support and insisting Israel do a full withdrawal out of that buffer zone. We're going to get to that in a moment. But I want to talk about some reporting indicating that the White House may be not necessarily reporting the full picture on the life lost of service members, of U.S. service members. Are we getting a full picture as to how many U.S. service members have actually been lost in the line of fire in this war between the United States and Iran, and or wounded, Monica?
Man, there isn't total clarity on that, and it's a really important point that you raise. And remember that originally this military conflict was donned under the umbrella of Operation Epic Fury, which is a conflict that, according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others in the administration, had formally concluded, had ended when you had the ceasefire and those initial peace talks that were taking place. But of course, over the last 10 days, there has been this resumption of military action, and the question is, under what umbrella what is that taking place? Is that a continuation? Is this a new military operation? We know that the White House formally notified Congress that these military actions were resuming in a more formal way, but the White House and the Pentagon have not really been clear on that answer. They did say in the last couple of days, with news of those service members who had died, that was related to an ongoing operation known as Operation Inherent Resolve, which is supposed to be the mission dedicated to continuing the eradication of ISIS. But there are now questions about whether that was related to that or a broader mission that the U.S. was carrying out, again, in this region that was or was not related to the specific conflict with Iran. So there are many more questions that we have been raising, that our Pentagon team has been raising on this, that they have not been forthcoming with. But something important just to note there, Yasmin, is that the president did confirm he does plan to attend the dignified transfer of those remains of U.S. service members when their bodies and their remains come back to the United States. We expect as early as tomorrow in Dover.
Yeah, incredibly important to get some clarity, especially for the American electorate. And speaking of the American electorate, I just want to get some clarity when it comes to the midterm elections, because the president was asked as to whether or not he essentially is taking into account the elections that are just around the corner for him and considering his actions against Iran. And if he thinks Iran is doing the same, he doesn't feel like it's going to harm him one way or the other, but he's not taking that into account. What is the reality on the ground, Monica, from the White House, especially as you're looking at gas prices that are going in the wrong direction for this president, the holdup, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which, by the way, we have to continue to remind folks was not a problem before this war began.
Yeah, that stood out to me as well, because the president is effectively saying, well, it's not going to be a problem for me because the name Donald Trump is not on the ballot in November. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a problem for Republican allies, for all of the Republican lawmakers who are up for elected office and who are certainly potentially concerned about what this may mean for them, and who have expressed as much publicly, saying that they would like the White House to be talking about other issues or to be focusing on affordability and what this administration can be doing on that, given high gas prices and other just costs that we have seen go up, and with inflation continuing as well. So that is certainly an interesting viewpoint into how the president is going to potentially assess this. But of course, he has said in the past that when thinking about Iran, when making decisions about this war, that he doesn't factor in Americans' personal financial situations, and that isn't something that is affecting the way he is making these very, very difficult decisions. So I thought that was a pretty noteworthy comment there, Yasmin.
So let's talk about Lebanon for a moment, because you noted that Israel pulling out of Lebanon was a major key part of the MOU and has not been abided by since day one of this MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between Iran and the United States. For folks that don't know, just to give a little bit of a briefer on this, right, there was this buffer zone, which I know that you know this, that was set up by the IDF in southern Lebanon. And as part of the MOU, Israel was instructed to pull out of Lebanon. They are now inside of, as you mentioned, kind of this pilot zone agreement in which they're kind of sampling to a couple of villages in the south of Lebanon, in which the IDF is pulling out of to see if the Lebanese army can kind of step in and feasibly control. There were reports, though, and the president was asked about this in the Oval, that the Lebanese army said that they were fired on by the IDF in one of these villages as part of this pilot zone agreement. What are we learning about that and the extent to which the president will go in order to help the Lebanese army and the Lebanese president if he were to ask for more help in making sure Israel pulls out?
And the president said that he did expect that is something they were going to be discussing, and we do expect that the Lebanese president is going to be seeking that kind of additional assistance. The president said that he was briefed on those reports that you just mentioned about that skirmish, that incident just hours ago and right before this meeting. So he said that the U.S. was going to be taking a closer look at it to see what might need to be responded to there or what they may need to do. As a reminder, Yasmin, as all of this has been happening, there were these separate talks between Israel and Lebanon that the U.S. was facilitating, hosting here at the State Department, having Secretary Rubio take a key role in. And so that is something that the U.S. is invested in trying to help with and trying to see to the finish line and trying to see if this can continue. But very importantly here, there is also certainly the relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and how he is thinking about this, which may be very different. And those two things come into conflict pretty frequently. We've seen that example time and time again. And then the White House has to figure out where it wants to fall within that range.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.